Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, my name is Zalinda Firdausyiah. I am from Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia, and in this occasion, I would like to present my research result. My research itself is entitled Analysis of Translation Techniques in Thesis Abstracts of English and Indonesian Language and Literature Undergraduate Students. Here is the outline of my presentation. My presentation will cover the introduction, aim of the study, methodology, and findings and discussion. Now moving on to the first section, which is introduction. So translation can simply be understood as the process of transferring a text from a source language to a target language. In academic context, translation is a crucial part of knowledge transfer. If a research paper is not translated properly, the process of knowledge transferring may be disrupted. A research paper that is not written in English must be translated into English if the writer wishes it to get published in international journals. In a similar context, college students in Indonesia who are in their final year are also required to write their thesis research abstracts in English in addition to their Indonesian abstracts. According to Cross and Oppenheim in 2006 and Colte in 2010, an abstract itself is one of the most crucial parts of a research paper, as it represents the content of a research in a more condensed way. An abstract, according to Kurniawan, Lubi Suherdi, and Danuwijaya in 2009, an abstract should help readers to gain a preview of information in a quick and comprehensive way. Not only that, an abstract also acts as an outline to help the readers understand its full content. Thus, abstracts that are translated with poor translation may hinder it from getting discovered and read by many people, as well as getting published in international publication. In relation to translation techniques have been proposed by many researchers in this field. Newmark in 1988 have proposed translation techniques that have been used in many research. Newmark's translation techniques, along with other techniques from other translation technique experts such as Nida in 1964 and Vinay and Darbelinet in 2004, were revisited by Molina and Albir in their research published in 2002. Molina and Albir developed their set of translation techniques, which consists of adaptation, amplification, borrowing, calque, compensation, description, discursive creation, established equivalent, generalization, linguistic amplification, linguistic compression, literal translation, modulation, particularization, reduction, substitution, transposition, and variation. The techniques they proposed have been used by many researchers, but they are seldom used in the academic field. This strategy has been used, for example, to analyze a religious tourism brochure in Indonesia. This research was conducted by Sodik, Budiman, and Hidayat in 2020. Their study found out that translation techniques that were used the most in translating the Indonesian brochure to English are pure borrowing, established equivalent, pure borrowing and established equivalent, and deletion. The translation techniques by Molina and Albir has also been used by Al-Farisi in his research published in 2020 to analyze translation techniques and translation ideology of Quranic metaphor, or known as kinayah. His study finds that the translation techniques used were target language oriented. The techniques were also used to identify translation techniques in Aladdin movie script, which was conducted by Anwar Haryanti and Mukti, also published in 2020. The findings showed that linguistic compression was used the most prominently, followed by established equivalence. Molina and Albir's translation techniques have been used to analyze text in many different contexts, but translation techniques in academic paper, specifically undergraduate students' theses, is not often explored. Thus, This research aims to identify the translation strategies that are typically used by undergraduate students of English language and literature and Indonesian language and literature study program in writing their abstracts. This study is a qualitative study that analyzed undergraduate students' abstract that employed Molina and Albier's translation techniques to analyze the data. The study intended to identify translation techniques that undergraduate students from different study programs in writing their abstracts. The data consists of a corpus of 60 thesis abstracts. The abstracts were extracted from the thesis of undergraduate English language and literature and Indonesian language and literature students. The abstracts that were taken must be written in two languages, English and Indonesian. However, due to the limited availability of the abstracts in Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia's online repository, the year of the abstract's publication was not considered. Here is how the researcher collect the data. First, the researcher accessed Universitas Pendidikan Indonesia's online repository. Second, the thesis abstracts were checked starting from the most recently published. If it was written in English and Indonesian, the abstracts were downloaded. Third, the abstracts that were downloaded in PDF format were converted into document format. The title, author name, and year of publication were written on top of the abstract. The data analysis process were as follows. So the researcher used Molina and Albier's translation techniques as the main framework of the study and to analyze the abstract's translation techniques. The techniques proposed by Molina and Albier were used because each techniques were distinguished more clearly and there is a functional dynamic in the techniques. The abstracts were broken down into sentences as the units of analysis. The text written in the source language and target language were put next to each other in order to ease the analysis process. Then, the translation techniques of each sentence were identified. Next, the translation techniques were counted by using tally marks to find out how many times the translation techniques occurred. Finally, the result of translation technique analysis between abstracts written by English language and literature students were compared to Indonesian language and literature students. Now let's move on to the next section, which is the findings and discussion section. In the slide, we can see the salience table of each translation techniques that occurred in abstracts written by English language and literature students, or the first group, and Indonesian language and literature students, or the second group. All the numbers are in percent. So as we can see from the table, literal translation is a translation technique that occurred the most in both abstract groups, with 100% occurrence each. The literal translation technique occurred 106 times in English students' abstracts and 138 times in Indonesian students' abstracts. Literal translation itself is a technique of translating a source text into a target text word by word. From the analysis, it can be seen that this technique may cause the abstract writer to disregard grammatical rules and thus make a translation mistake in their abstract. This is found in Research Abstract 7 of the sample. A writer directly translated the sentence, sumber daya penelitian diperoleh melalui studi kepustakaan dan observasi lapangan, into source of research data obtained through library research and field observation. The second most used translation technique is borrowing, which occurs 73% in English language and literature students abstract and 67% in Indonesian language and literature abstracts. The technique occurred 22 times in English students abstracts and 27 times in Indonesian students abstracts. In theory, the borrowing technique uses a word or expression from a source language without any changes, or changing the spelling to fit the spelling rules. In abstracts written by English students, the authors employed pure borrowing to display theoretical framework, findings, and discussions. and conclusion, And in abstracts written by Indonesian students, however, this technique is often used to adapt titles of works used as the data source. This is done to keep the originality of the title. The technique was also applied to Indonesian terms that do not have an English equivalent. This technique was also used to display institution and place. Similar to English students, Indonesian students also employ pure borrowing to translate their abstracts. And then there is an interesting gap but in the percentage in the occurrence of Calcu translation technique. The Calcu technique occurred 73% in the first group and only 7% in the second group. This technique translates a word or phrase literally, either lexically or structurally. This technique is different to literal translation that translates a text word to word. The English students and Indonesian students similarly employ this technique to translate a term or their theoretical framework. A translation that also has a huge occurrence gap were compensation, with 40% in the first group and only 7% in the second group. Compensation is a technique where an element of a source text is introduced in another place in the target text. From the analysis, it was found that the technique was applied to introduce a part of the text that went through the reduction technique. Also from the table, we can see that other translation techniques such as adaptation, amplification, discursive creation, established equivalent, generalization, modulation, reduction, and transposition occurred less than 40% in all of the abstracts. In conclusion, the study was aimed to identify translation techniques that were employed by students from two different study programs in translating their abstracts. There are 11 translation techniques that are typically used by undergraduate students of English language and literature, while Indonesian language and literature students only use 10 translation techniques in translating their abstracts. However, it should be taken into consideration that the result of this present work only concerned by undergraduate students of language and literature study program as the writer of the analyzed abstracts. The study concludes that regardless of the study program, it is found that literal translation is the technique that was used the most. And this point brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.